Welcome. Hello, colleagues. Welcome to this session, a beginner's guide to gender mainstreaming for the public sector in tourism, organised jointly by UN Tourism and UN Women. We are very pleased to have you with us today. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you so much for your interest in this topic. My name is Lucy Ferguson. I am a trainer and consultant in gender equality. I have been working with UN Tourism since 2008 on issues around gender equality and women's empowerment in the tourism sector. And I have also been working with UN Women since 2013, collaborating as a trainer and a gender mainstreaming specialist. I am also the lead author of the gender mainstreaming guidelines that we'll be discussing today, and currently working with UN Women to develop a gender mainstreaming training package. So very happy to be with you and to hopefully share with you some insights on tourism, gender mainstreaming in the tourism sector. The objectives of today's session are to increase awareness of gender mainstreaming and how it can be implemented by national tourism authorities, administrations, and other public tourism bodies. To facilitate national tourism administrations and other tourism bodies' work when they are working to reduce gender inequalities in a systematic way. Third, to share some of the main lessons learned in designing gender transformative interventions in tourism, focusing specifically on the sector and the specific challenges that this can pose. And finally, to share some practices and tools that can help to ensure tourism policies and public programs are designed to respond to the needs of women, girls, men, boys, and people of diverse genders, taking into account intersectionality and a gender equality approach. We will be giving an introduction to gender mainstreaming. If you not clear what that means yet, don't worry. I hope you will be more clear by the end. We will also be sharing some experiences of working on gender equality in the public sector. We have here colleagues from the Brazil Ministry of Tourism and the Liberia National Tourism Association. And then we'll be hoping that you will be inspired to get started with gender mainstreaming in your public tourism organization. And we'll give you some tips on how to do that. I'd like to pass to my colleague Ben Owen now to explain to you some of the aspects of how the webinar will work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Just very quickly, some logistics. Welcome to everybody. For English speakers, the webinar will be broadcast live on YouTube. We have sent that round. It is on the UN Tourism website and on our social media. That will be in original language only in English with international sign language interpretation. For English speakers who are in the Zoom, please stay on original language or the English interpretation button to be able to hear the webinar. Para los y las participantes hispanohablantes que están con nosotros en el Zoom hoy, para acceder a la interpretación hay que pulsar en el botón interpretación que está abajo en tu pantalla y elegir español. Et pour les participants francophones qui est avec nous aujourd'hui, s'il vous plaît, c'est que disponible dans le Zoom. Il faut appuyer sur sur l'option interprétation qui est en bas de vos écrans dans le Zoom. لتعيل الترجمة يتحدوا على زر interpretation الموجود أسفل الشاشة واختاروا اللغة العربية. Thank you, Lucy. Logistics over. I'll pass back over to you for the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you for your multilingual explanation. So we have two welcome videos to give us the opening remarks to this webinar. So the first video will be from UN Tourism Executive Director Zorica Urosevic.
Gentlemen, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, welcome to this important online seminar focused on gender mainstreaming for the public sector in tourism. It is an honor and a privilege to have you all connected with us today as we address one of the most vital aspects of sustainable tourism development, gender equality. The benefits of achieving gender equality are clear. Research shows that gender diversity leads to better decision-making, stronger organizations, and more sustainable outcomes. When women thrive, communities thrive, and tourism flourishes as a tool for peace, preserving cultures, and economic empowerment. I would like to warmly thank Deputy Executive Director Nyadjazi Gumbawadza and our colleagues at UN Women for co-organizing this event with us. Since our first joint global study on women in tourism that was published in 2010, our two organizations have worked ever closer year on year to combat gender inequality in the tourism sector. We have worked to detail women's contribution to tourism, revealing not only the enormous opportunity that the sector holds for empowerment, but also the barriers we face to achieving gender equality. The tourism sector, as we all know, is a powerful driver of economic growth, cultural exchange, and global connectivity, and women make up more than half of its global workforce. Yet, women also often occupy lower-paying, lower-skilled jobs. In tourism, the higher up the professional ladder you look, the fewer women you will find. Today, we are here to learn how the public sector can lead the way in changing this, helping to create equal opportunities for the girls of today to become the captains, coders, and CEOs of tomorrow. Today's event is aimed at the public sector in tourism. Tomorrow, we have an event just for businesses. Gender mainstreaming is the globally agreed strategy for promoting gender equality, but for many in tourism, it is seen as something too complicated or too abstract to actually do. Today and tomorrow, we will learn that gender mainstreaming can be done by anyone in tourism. From the smallest micro-business to the largest destinations welcoming millions of visitors a year, all of us can make a difference. I would like to thank all the participants, speakers, and organizers for being connected to this webinar series. Your commitment is truly appreciated and inspiring. Every action we take, every decision we make that is guided by gender mainstreaming will bring us one step closer to achieving Sustainable Goal 5, achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls, creating the tourism of tomorrow where everyone has the opportunity to benefit, no matter their gender. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to have that such a reinforcing introduction from the Executive Director UN Tourism, Zorica Rasovic. We thank her very much for those remarks and for adding as well the importance and really the reason why we're here, because as she says, the further you go up in terms of power and decision making, the fewer women we find. So I would now like to pass to my colleague from UN Women, Nyadjazi Gumbawadza is Deputy Executive Director for Normative Support for UN System Coordination and Programme Results. So I'm very pleased to have her here with us in the form of her video message. And it's great again to have this joint institutional support, as Zorica said, and this is a collaboration which has been going on for many years. So it's great to have this example of shared goals and working together. So I'll pass now to the video.
My great pleasure to join you today for this very, very important webinar, Beginner's Guide to Gender Mainstreaming for the Public Sector in Tourism, a collaborative effort between UN Tourism and my organization, UN Women. I warmly acknowledge the presence of Zorica Jurosevic, the Executive Director of UN Tourism, as well as our esteemed speakers and participants. This gathering comes at a pivotal time as we approach the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action in 2025, and as we strive to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 5 on gender equality. Women are the lifeblood of the tourism industry, making up to 54% of its global workforce. Yet, they often face profound inequalities. Women are disproportionately represented in lower paid, precarious roles with limited access to education, to training, and to career growth and career advancement. Leadership positions are still largely out of reach, leaving their voices unheard in decision making. Issues such as the wage gap, workplace harassment, and labor trafficking continue to hinder their full participation and empowerment. These are issues that we should continue to prioritize in our response. But tourism holds extraordinary potential to transform women's lives. We must unlock this potential by actively promoting women's leadership and amplifying their voices in policymaking. Women-led businesses and service providers must be supported. And much more fairer opportunities must be created through gender-responsive procurement practices. This is an innovation we've seen in various countries and which empowers women and girls. Workplace environments must prioritize safety and dignity, eradicating harassment and exploitation, whilst offering women equal access to decent work. Not only should we have equal pay, but the work must be decent. This vision can only be realized through gender mainstreaming, a powerful strategy that integrates gender equality into the very fabric of tourism policies and programs. UN Women and UN Tourism have long championed this approach. Together, we have highlighted the contributions of women in tourism. We have together identified the barriers to their progress, and we have together, and we continue to raise the global awareness of their essential role in this industry. The role of women and girls cannot be underestimated. In 2022, our Center Stage program developed guidelines for public sector tourism administrations to embed gender equality perspectives into their policies and into their strategies. This very, very important webinar provides a critical platform for equipping stakeholders with these necessary tools to implement these guidelines and to effectively bring about meaningful change. Because gender mainstreaming in and by itself is insufficient unless if it results in meaningful change for reducing inequality, for empowering women's rights, for empowering women and securing their rights. Tourism is a vibrant sector that can deliver dignity, that delivers empowerment and economic independence to women. By working together, we can ensure that this industry truly values the women who sustain it and leads the way in advancing gender equality worldwide. The future lies in our investment to gender equality and women's empowerment within the tourism sector. Again, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to our speaker from UN Women. So we've heard that there is inequality for women in the tourism sector. We've heard why that matters, and we've heard that it needs to be addressed. But what can you do? And what is gender mainstreaming? So gender mainstreaming is a technical term, but it's something which is really accessible and understandable. So it's a strategy. Gender mainstreaming is a strategy for achieving the goal of gender equality worldwide, which means the empowerment of women and girls and equal rights for women, men, and people of diverse genders. So gender mainstreaming, number one, is a strategy. And it's a strategy that allows us to incorporate and integrate the different knowledge, experiences, and contributions of people of all genders in the policy process. Gender mainstreaming is relevant for all sectors and all policy areas. There, unfortunately, is no country in the world, no sector in the world where we have anything close to equality for women. So there is no area in which this is not relevant. And that's why we pay so much attention to gender mainstreaming. And finally, it's a process which requires attention, which is where you come in. This is something that can be tackled by all of us, but we have to start. And today we hope to help you think where you might start in order to get going with your gender mainstreaming journey. Gender mainstreaming, as mentioned by the UN Women colleague, it matters. It comes from decades of activism and was finally developed during the Beijing Platform for Action 1995. And we know that we're now coming up to the 30th anniversary of that. So it was established 30 years ago. At that time, it was hoped that we wouldn't need gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming should cease to exist when we have gender equality. That's its goal, gender equality. But we're still going. So 30 years on, we're still talking about gender mainstreaming. Legally, it's enshrined with the UN in the UN frameworks through the agreed conclusions 1997. And it's really important to know that as reiterated by our colleague from UN Women, this is reinforced in Agenda 2030 and is really the agreed global strategy for achieving Sustainable Development Goal 5, as well as other gender-related goals. So that's what it is, where it comes from. The question is, how do we do it? This is why we produced the guidelines on gender mainstreaming for public tourism institutions. And we work at 3 different levels on the public sector. We have the institutional level, the programmatic and policy level, and the thematic level. And we'll be looking at those in this webinar as we go along. But I think the key concept, the most important thing, if you just take one thing away from today about what gender mainstreaming is, it's that it's 2 things at the same time. It's not one or the other of these. Gender mainstreaming requires both of these actions. It requires that, number one, we integrate gender equality into everything that we do, programs, functions, policies, projects. We take gender issues and gender equality seriously. And secondly, we also have specific interventions that target women and girls and gender equality. So we need both of these things in order for it to be considered gender mainstreaming. So that dual track approach is, number one, integrating gender equality into everything that we do. And secondly, targeted specific interventions, activities, policies towards gender equality. And these two need to work together. You can certainly start with one and move to the second, but you need to have both in mind in order to really get started with your work on gender mainstreaming. So what are the stages? There are 3 phases. First of all, we need to start with the institutional level. We need some support, some indication of support from senior leadership. We need to put institutional arrangements in place. We need some financial human resources, and we need some accountability mechanisms. This is an ideal type. This is what an ideal type gender mainstreaming would look like. We acknowledge that sometimes we have to be pragmatic, realistic, and strategic. So wherever you can start from there. The next aspect is programmatic, where we look at program and policy, analysis, design, etc. And then the thematic areas as well. So we heard a little about women's tourism businesses, about leadership, policy and decision making, for example. So these are the 3 different ways in which we can look at and understand gender mainstreaming in the tourism sector. How does this twin track approach that we mentioned, or dual track approach, how would that work specifically in the context of tourism? So our goal is gender equality and the empowerment of women in tourism. That means not just equal opportunities, but the realization of rights and the equal enjoyment of those rights for women in the sector. So what does that mean in terms of the 2 tracks? In terms of the integrated aspect, we would like to see that gender perspectives are integrated into all aspects of tourism policy, programs, functions. This means thinking about women and girls in every part of the work that we do, whether it's internal policy or external policy, whether it's budgeting, procurement. All of these different aspects are opportunities for looking at gender perspectives and gender equality. At the same time, we want targeted approaches. We need to close this gap. We need specific interventions, whether this is support for women entrepreneurs in the tourism sector, whether it's the enforcement of laws such as the ILO Convention on the Prevention of Harassment and Sexual Harassment in the Place of Work, whatever those targeted interventions are, whether it's a leadership program for women in the tourism public sector or private sector, these are the kind of actions that we're talking about. These 2 go together, and they support us to reach our outcome of gender equality and women's empowerment in tourism. So within all of this, there's definitely something that you can do, either whether it's on integration or targeted approaches. So how do you get started? These are the steps that we set out in the guidelines, and I believe that we have a link to the guidelines in the chat if you would like to have a look at those, and we invite you to look at those in more detail. And I'm just going to talk you through very plainly the key steps to this. First of all, establish institutional measures for gender mainstreaming. And our colleague from Brazil is going to talk to us a little bit about what Brazil has done in terms of institutional measures to promote internal gender mainstreaming. Secondly, the second step is to look at gender equality in the tourism policy and program cycle. And we'll be looking at an example from our colleague from Liberia, talking about gender equality in policy in Liberia. The next step is to conduct a gender analysis and to focus on the thematic areas. And then finally, you can, once you've taken these 3 steps, or at any stage, you can look at your own gender mainstreaming action plan for your institution. So I'll talk you through these, and we'll take some examples as we go from our colleagues. So, step 1, institutional measures. What does this mean in practice? It means that essentially institutions need to have their own house in order to think about gender mainstreaming. So ideally, and we would encourage you please to start putting your questions in the chat. If you have anything that you'd like to know more about, if you have any questions, please, there are no stupid questions. All questions are welcome. We're very open to discuss all aspects of this with you today. That's what we're here for. So what does this mean inside public sector institutions? And again, you may find there's something here that you can do. So do we have any focal point, for example, for gender equality? This is something that we can do, a simple action. Is there a possibility to allocate some financial resources or human resources to support gender mainstreaming efforts? And how can we think about accountability? Other aspects, as we will discuss with our colleague from Brazil, include looking at the position of women within the public administration itself, within the organization itself. So I'm now delighted to pass to my colleague, Camilla Zardini. She is General Coordinator at the International Relations Advisory of the Ministry of Tourism in Brazil. Camilla, I'm delighted to pass over to you. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you all. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here representing the Ministry of Tourism, representing our minister and our vice minister, which for the first time is a woman. So for the first time since the creation of our ministry, we have a vice minister that is a woman. So when we start talking about gender equality and institutional gender mainstreaming, and in this occasion, as we are right now, that marks the first day of the activism against gender violence until the 10th of December. It's a pleasure to bring some of the measures that we're doing as a ministry. So it is not easy for sure when you talk about a country so big as Brazil, considering everything that we have to take in consideration to address a cause of gender equality and bring women to the leadership positions, right? But when you think about the tourism sector, not only in the world, but also in Brazil and also inside of our ministry, women are the majority of the workforce. Well, when we focus on managing this gender parity in the ministry, it was not always like this, and we still have a lot to do. And we know that we only had so far 2 ministers that are women, but we have advanced a lot. So today, the majority of the leadership positions that includes coordinators, managers, out of the 3 secretaries that we have in our ministry, 2 of them are women. We can see that we had advanced and have a change that it can be observed. So this is something to be proud of. Why? Because how to address the necessities of a sector that has the majority of women in the whole country in rural tourism and entrepreneurship and other sectors in trade and agencies and accommodation sector, how to address it if we don't have in the leadership positions women that can understand also some of the problems, some of the flaws they have yet, and gender equality along all of the sectors, not only tourism, right? So we want to bring and we want to try to make it an employment in community, in qualification, and again in leadership, not only inside our ministry, but for our society, for the tourism sector and as a whole. For that, today we have proudly a department that is focused on diversity and gender equality, and that has been one of the main actors for the creation inside of the ministry of the Committee for Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion in our Ministry of Tourism of Brazil. Of course, that you have to take in consideration that none of that would be possible if our leadership above would not didn't have this view. We're not able to see the importance of this. Also, when you think about the guidelines that brings the women principle, women empowering principles, when you have a sector that is so big and women workforce, if you work on qualifying them, on bringing them to the main table so they can speak, so they can make decisions, then you will qualify the sector as a whole too. The impacts are very positive for that. So the committee that we have inside of our ministry today brings and seeks partners actively in policies, events, and brings us to this discussion, not only within our sector, but in the federal government as a whole. So when we have an opportunity of showing off how the tourism sector is not only economic driver, but a powerful tool, and that women are so important and so big in number in this sector, and we can bring this to a macro view of a government, of the federal government. We can try to show them how it is important for the community as a whole, of course, to apply more efforts to thrive on making it a little more effective. And for effectiveness, that is something that we face, that is a challenge. Data collecting, data tracking, and for that we need to do partnership. We need to talk with other entities, not only in the public sector but also in the private sector. When you take in consideration the trade entities within the tourism sector, they also are important stakeholders on helping us getting getting track of this data, where women is working, where women is entrepreneur, where they're having equality of income when they're not. And usually we know very well that it's not. So another thing for a stakeholder engagement on gender mainstreaming is that we have this joy of announce today that we are signing this afternoon, right after our event here, an MOU with women tourism, UN Women of Brazil, for women that travel alone. And this is an intention of bringing more safety, more comfort for these women that wants to have their free time traveling. Woman doesn't want only to work, to have space in their own homes, to have space in society, in politics. They also want to have fun. They also want to travel. They also want to do tourism, and they have to feel safe about it. So how do you do it? We as a public sector, we try to seek in our partners a way of bringing these facilities, this possibility to these women. And today we are signing this agreement with UN Women Brazil. So we expect to find good results of it. But of course, again, one of the things that we have to think as a society, as a global society, but not only in Brazil, is how to take track, how to have track of this data, of these actions, and how to address the problems when you see that it's not being effective. This will happen here inside our ministry, inside of our departments itself, and inside the society, the country, the world as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Camila. Really interesting to hear the experiences of the ministry, particularly congratulations on the work that you've done, which is not easy, which is looking at gender parity within the ministry. So looking at who holds what positions, how do we make sure that women are promoted fairly, etc. So thanks so much for sharing that with us, as well as your work on diversity and inclusion, really important. And it's always good to hear of institutional collaborations. So obviously you've done a lot at the ministry, and many of the people listening will probably be at an earlier stage in this process. So can I ask you, in terms of how to get started, what would you recommend is a good starting point in terms of institutional aspects of gender equality for other public sector organizations? Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Well, as I don't want to be, I kind of mentioned, but I want to repeat it because it's very important. For you to prove a point and for you to make yourself to be heard, you need to bring the numbers. And it is already shown that not only worldwide, but also in our country, and I am very sure that in a lot of other places and countries, woman develops, does, is a very important part of our sector workforce. Qualifying this woman, giving them the opportunity to speak, to sit at the table. So you only convince everybody or anybody if you have data, if you have this. So once you have the numbers, you will you'll be able maybe to prove that once you give them the opportunity and space of being a leader, of leading a sector, of leading, and for that they need qualification, for that they need to be put there to speak. They need to be heard. So first of all, I believe you have to bring the data, the numbers. When you have it, you also can speak, and then you convince, and you will show that the effectiveness of the work of this woman that are already leading, because of course you're going to have a lot of women leading here and there, and you can bring the effectiveness of their work. We have an award here in our ministry that is a tourism award that last year we had 3 women as finalists in the sector. So they're of course doing something, and I'm sure that Brazil is not the only one. So when you take a look in this type of situation, you can show that you have a lot of entrepreneur women and rural places and rural sector for tourism too, and not only for accommodation agencies. They are already, and they're doing a great work, and they could be doing more, because if you take them out of these positions that they sometimes are being undermined or underpaid or underseen or under a lot of things, they will show what they can do for economy, for the country, for the sector, for the world, with a different vision, with a feminine vision that I am sure that doesn't need to be proven how positive it is.
Thank you so much, Camila. So just to take some examples there, the importance of data. Please, UN Tourism collects data and has data. We also have reports, regional reports on women in tourism, and also to make visible the work that women are already doing within your institution and to celebrate that work. So there are some really good concrete examples to start to collect data, to look at where women are within the ministry, within the sector, and then to celebrate that work. So thank you so much for those examples, Camila. And it's really great to see Brazil leading by example in terms of really taking very seriously gender mainstreaming, within the tourism ministry. It's not necessarily to do all of these things, but as we say, great if you can, any of these contributions that you can make are worthwhile. So please continue to get in touch, ask your questions. We have space for questions here in the chat. We also welcome good practice examples shared from Luana Gonzalez from the Costa Rica Tourism Board. Thank you so much for sharing your program. Please look here at the example from Costa Rica Tourism Board about female solo travel. And thank you for sharing that good practice. Any other examples are also welcome. Please share those in the chat and we will mention those. So that was stage one, looking at things within the ministry, getting some traction, getting some movement. So now we will move on to the next step, step 2. So now we need to look at some of the aspects of gender issues in tourism policy and programming. So what does this mean? The decisions that we make, the policies and strategies that we develop, and the projects and programs that we run from our administrations and authorities. So what does this mean in real terms? It means we need to understand what is happening within the sector. As Camila just said, we need data. Often there is data. If there's data, we find it. We look for it. If there isn't, then sometimes we need to collect that data ourselves. We need to make sure that all of our programs are gender responsive. Gender responsive means meet the needs of different groups and take into account inequalities within the development of programs and policies. We need some resources to do this. We don't always need a huge amount of resources, and they're not always financial resources. Sometimes we're talking about human resources. That means gender expertise. It may mean, for example, a partnership with UN Women, looking for gender expertise there. So there are all kinds of ways that we can look for these human and financial resources that we need to do this work. It doesn't necessarily always need to be a huge amount of funding or a huge amount of time. What it does need is acknowledgement that this is important and to start work on this. Then we need to get to work on implementing gender mainstreaming, and we also need to understand how is this happening. We need to monitor and evaluate what we're doing for gender equality in our tourism policies programming. So I'm delighted to now introduce our second speaker, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what's been happening in Liberia in terms of integrating gender equality into different aspects of the policy. So I'm delighted to introduce May Bright Uri. She is president of Liberia National Tourism Association, and I'm really pleased to pass over to you, May. Thank you so much. It's a delight to have you with us.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. And let me say thanks also to UN Tourism, UN Women, Ben, and everybody else who organized this. And also, I'm thankful to be able to share your story on gender mainstreaming in our national development policy. Thanks, Lucy. You highlighted a lot of items and aspects that are very important to gender mainstreaming. I'll give you a little background of the policy. Liberia in January inaugurated a new government, and as is common, this government had to develop a national development policy. And that policy is actually the master plan for the country for the next 6 years. This was a great opportunity for the Liberia National Tourism Association, which is an association of course, private sector stakeholders in the tourism sector. So it was a great opportunity for us because this document is a national policy document. So the strategy, plans, resource allocation, et cetera, that will be used by government and will be a guiding factor for the private sector. And also it will be where the international partners would allocate resources And that's what they will spend all of their time and resources on. But more importantly for us in the association is the fact that this government, of its 6 pillars, tourism is one of them. This has not happened before, so we were excited and had to be a part of making sure that we were a part of developing the policy or the development document. So this work started in April. I'm happy to say it's now complete. We await publishing of the document, and hopefully it will be rolled out at the beginning of next year. So what was our role as the Tourism Association in this document, in developing the document, but most especially where it relates to ensuring gender mainstreaming? So my colleague spoke a lot about data. Data is so important. The very first thing we did was to try to provide the consultants with data on the current status of gender involvement within the tourism sector. This we hope would guide them as they went out to collect information on the development of the policy. We gave them information about how many women are employed in the sector, how many women businesses are in the sector, how many women we are able to find that were in different hierarchy positions within organizations. We also try to get them the understanding that you have rural women in tourism, as well as you have the urban women. And those community-based women, it's very important to address them because most of the time they are left out. So those are the kinds of information we gave them. We gave them also the barriers to women existing in the tourism sector. That means getting into the tourism sector and also staying within the tourism sector. Of course, we have the situation of culture. Some of the women are culturally limited from going out to work within the tourism sector, within any sector for that matter. And obviously, as is worldwide, in most developing countries, you have a limitation when it comes to education. You also have a limitation when it comes to finances with women, especially on both sides of the coin, in the rural areas as well as in the urban areas. So we're able to give them that kind of information of what we had. And also on how women are contributing to all of the areas within tourism. Okay, so those are some of the data. The data, some of it really, we didn't have a lot of it. I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the data was not current, but at least they had a guideline for which to go with. We also tried to give them define objectives of what we would like to see. This is where the sector is as far as women participation, and this is where we are hoping to grow on an annual basis. Also, as I mentioned before, we wanted to make sure that the policy had equal access to training. And the training, what we did was we worked with the Ministry of Youth and Sports to ensure that all the training programs that have to do with vocational training, that women had access to those resources as well as much as their male counterparts. And as a result, within there is a component where a hotel is actually going to be developed. And within that hotel, there's going to be training. It's going to be like a training hotel. And we ask that that it be a 50-50 split. Also, the wage bill, when it comes to how much women are being paid, and you will note that in most countries, and Liberia is no exception, women are normally paid less than men for the same jobs that they're doing. So those are the kinds of things that we made sure are actually in the policy. And we also did resource allocation. We went out to make sure that there were resource allocations that women were giving. Emphasis was put on financial support for women entrepreneurs, and also that government would support the purchasing or the services of women in in the tourism sector. In addition, we said these policies are put in place, but if the national budget does not reflect gender equality, it's not going to work. You can have all of these policies, but you still need resources. It's most important that we have resources that will actually, one, carry on and make sure these policies work. So all of this that we did, right, we used it, we gave it to the consultants to make sure when they went for stakeholder engagement, we were not permitted to go for those stakeholder engagement, but we say many, many, many thanks to UN Women who hired a consultant. I think two of my colleagues before this spoke about the fact that financially, there are constraints. And we would have hoped, of course, UN Women also has their limitations, but we'd have hoped that more people, more gender-friendly women would have been able to join Caroline going out, because what she did was she went out to all 15 political divisions within Liberia, that is the 15 counties, and she hold meetings with women, and she worked along, brought back all of that information and worked along with the consultants to come up with this document. So in a nutshell, Lucy and fellow colleagues online, this is what we as the Liberia National Tourism Association did to kind of ensure that there is gender mainstreaming in our national development policy.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to hear you talk about this each time. Really congratulate you on doing so much, collecting so much information, pushing the collaboration with different public bodies, different ministries, and also with UN Women. So I think I would be interested to ask you if you can tell us about, I think we talked already about some of the challenges. You talked about financing, the funding restrictions that we face in whenever we're trying to work on gender equality. So I guess I would ask you, well, we have lots of people listening today who probably are not as advanced in terms of all of those aspects. You talked about the gender pay gap, data, all of the different things that you're doing to integrate this into the national policy. So if you could, based on your experience, what would you recommend to other either national tourism associations or tourism boards, any public or semi-public bodies in the tourism sector that want to get started with work on gender equality? What would you recommend to them? Thanks so much, May.
All right. The first thing I would say is, or maybe talk about the challenges that we had, and hopefully and hopefully that will guide, the others on how to get started. I think the first thing is being in the right space. You have to be in these spaces to know that these documents are even being developed. Okay, so what we as an association do is that we try to connect with the international partners. We work alongside with our Ministry of Tourism. We work alongside other women organizations. That's key, because they are in these spaces. And to be honest with you, how to get into this national development policy space, it was because of Caroline Bowen, who is the UN Women's consultant on this project. So she reached out to us and she said, this is the way to go. You all, where we gave her data, she also made us feed data into the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning, and they are the lead on this actual policy. So it's very important that you be in these spaces. If you're not in those spaces, you won't be able to find out the information. You have to also link up with other, as I said, women groups. And I will tell you why that is important. What I didn't speak to you about, because we have not actually engaged in it, but we did engage in this with the National Tourism Policy, where you need like-minded groups to be able to monitor and evaluate the document. So fine, the document is coming out. Implementation starts. How do you hold the government's feet to fire to say, this was supposed to be done in year 1? How come it's not done? We've defined goals, and these goals have not been met. How can we now go to the legislature and ensure that laws are passed, the budget is not passed unless these things, these resources that were allocated or earmarked for women are actually part of the budget. So you need to go back to it. You need to work with other women, okay? Funding, yeah, continue to say funding, to talk about funding. That's something everybody knows. But I think it was you, Lucy, who said, you don't need a lot of funding. And trust me, yes, funding is important, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is your plan of action and your human resources that will help you to carry out these things. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that is not important. It sure is. And I don't want to bore the group. I already went through. If anybody wants to, I can send it to them on the steps that we actually took to get to where we are today. One of the other challenges we had was the dormancy of the men are dormant. I mean, sorry, they dominate, not dormant, sorry. They dominate the whole stakeholder engagement. And so they are there in the group. You have the chiefs, you have men culturally that will not allow the women to speak out and actually say, this is what we really want. So sometimes the women are shy and the men are actually put there so that the women say the right things or don't say anything at all. And then even where it comes to the consultants, you have a lot of the consultants for the policy, they're mostly men. And another challenge that we had was the fact that, okay, all we had to do was to give our input. We'll talk to the Ministry of Finance and Development Planning. We speak to the consultants, but when it came back to the document, the zero draft of the document, we were not allowed to even see it as it stands. Even with all of our input, we have not seen the document and won't be able to see it on time for publication. So I'm hoping that, I've kind of answered the question, but if anybody has any other question, I guess Q&A, then they can ask. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, May. Maybe you have some questions for May that you'd like to put in the chat around the fantastic work on the National Development Policy in Liberia. I really come back to some of the points that you said about where to get started, make those connections, make those networks, take advantage of the networks and connections that you have. Also, your point about resources, yes, we need good people and we need some funding, but we don't have to wait until we have a huge amount of funding to start work on this. Once we start work, then we can start to advocate for the funds. But certainly, to get started, you mentioned various ways of doing that, the importance of working with women's organizations, alongside women's organizations. You mentioned the collaboration with UN Women. So it's collaborations, networks, having good people committed to this. And you also mentioned some of the challenges. How do we deal with some of those challenges in terms of dominance of the decision-making process? We have some responses that people are interested in those steps that you shared. We'd really like to see those, please. If they're publicly available, we'd love you to share those, please. That would be great. We're really interested in your lessons learned, and I think there's really a lot that we can take from this. So yes, we certainly have interest, and some colleagues saying congratulations on your work on women in tourism in Liberia. So thank you so much for that. I think it's a really good example of how also the kind of persistence, right? You got that, you inputted, the zero draft have come, you've not seen it yet, you're hoping to see it, you're questioning to see it. This kind of persistence, this continued persistence that we can do, these small actions that we can all take in different contexts to hold our governments and hold our ministries to account for their commitments on gender equality. How do you see this being integrated into the policy? These are questions that we can ask as women's organizations, as different tourism associations. We have the right to ask these questions. And sometimes, as you said, being there, being in the conversation is the first step. So thank you so much. We already have great examples from the first step, which is establish institutional measures for gender mainstreaming. So we now understand what that means. Who is working in the ministry? What kinds of positions do they have? Do we have a diversity and inclusion policy? How do we look at the way that women are represented within the ministry? We also had some examples of initiatives around MOUs with UN Women, both Brazil and Liberia working in collaboration with UN Women on gender equality in the tourism sector. Then the second step, as you see in the gender mainstreaming guidelines, is about how do we make sure that women and gender equality are visible in policy. So in the case of Liberia, we're looking at the National Development Policy, but the reason why that's such a good case study for us is that tourism is one of the 6 pillars of that policy. So it's a really key component to the future of development policy in Liberia. So it was really important, the work that's been done by May and her colleagues and UN Women and Caroline, as you mentioned, to get gender equality on the agenda, get it on the table, get talking about it. So those are the first 2 steps that we can take. And I think we have some practical tips shared for everyone on how to get started there. So the next stage would be to conduct a gender analysis of the tourism sector across different thematic areas. A gender analysis means we collect data, we analyze, we look at power relations within the sector, as May was talking about, who is dominant, in which spaces, where can women speak, where can women not speak. These are the kinds of questions that we need to look at. So we need to look what's going on in the tourism sector. And this can come from the Ministry of Tourism or any public tourism or administration or authority to really have a look at what's going on within the sector. So for our work, our collaborative work, with UN Women and UN Tourism, we have these 6 areas which we elaborate more clearly in the framework of the global reports on women in tourism and also the regional reports as well. So the questions that we need to understand about how women integrate with the tourism sector, how we are represented, and what kinds of the ways in which women interact with the sector. These are the kinds of questions that we need to ask. So as you can see, plenty of questions here that we need to ask ourselves to find out what's really going on before we start to really plan our gender mainstreaming strategy. How do women participate in tourism employment? Is this decent work? If we look at the ILO definition of decent work, when we look at how women are employed in the sector, would it match that description? In terms of entrepreneurship, where are the women? How is women's tourism entrepreneurship related to economic empowerment? Is participation in tourism businesses and tourism entrepreneurship leading to more financial independence and stability for women, or is it leading to more economic insecurity? In terms of leadership, where are women participating? How are they leading? How are they contributing to decision making? What goes on in the meetings when decisions are made? Do women speak? Thanks, May, for bringing up those informal dynamics of what often happens in decision-making scenarios. And secondly, what about policy? Again, coming back to May's presentation and the work in Liberia, is the policy addressing gender equality and women's empowerment? We spoke a little bit about training in both of the presentations. You both spoke a little bit about training. How do we make sure that training is fairly distributed for women and men? And how is gender equality included and integrated into tourism education? How are women living in tourism communities affected? And how are women's organisations integrated into tourism policy and decision making? Again, a key recommendation from May: work with women's organisations, bring them in to tourism policy making. That's how we really understand the needs of women, and also not just in urban tourism, but also rural. And finally, data, we've spoken about a lot, both presentations. So in terms of both the institutional aspects and programme and policy, data matters. What is data? What data is collected? How is it collected? And how is it used? And then finally, we move on to step 4. So what's step 4? When you look at the guidelines, you will see that we have developed a gender mainstreaming action plan for you to go through. So you have examples in there and then also a template. So for each area, you have objectives, actions, budgets, timeline, staff, and indicators. So again, just to reiterate, you don't need to fill every box of every table of this action plan. This is here for you to start thinking about where you might work, what you might start doing. So programmatic area, maybe you want to start work on resource allocation, for example. Okay, what can you do here? What are the concrete actions you can take? How much is this going to cost? When will it be done? And then finally, if you want to really start getting into the in-depth work, the different areas, which one might you select as a priority, and how might you start work on that? So I will come in the end to some examples of what you can do next in a very concrete way. So I'm just interested whether we have any questions, please, from participants. Please feel free to put your question into the chat or let us know if you'd like to ask a question to either of our speakers, Camila from Brazil or May from Liberia, or if you have a question for me about the guidelines. Okay, so to start with, we have a question for both speakers. We can see that there is already some work being done from and in the public sector about increasing gender equality. So interested to know from both of you, please, what has been the reaction from the private sector to these initiatives? Has this been generally positive? Has the private sector supported your work on trying to integrate gender into the tourism sector? And have you kind of made any alliances, or have they been resistances? So we'd love to hear a little bit about the relationship between these initiatives through the public sector and how that's playing out in the private sector. So if I could turn first to Camila, please, to answer the question, and then we will go to May. Thanks, Camila.
Sure, thank you for the question, and thank you again for the opportunity to bring this. So yes, it is also a challenge to talk in a different sector, right? From public to private, because sometimes the initiatives, the priorities, also the resources will be in a different phase. But for our experience so far and for what we have seen for the world is changing. It's good, it's changing, right? And we have the opportunity of talking about gender equality and this our mainstream gender in this public sector, in the private sector, with a lot more space, with a lot more tranquility. Let's put it like this. We have an action actually that we have involved in the last year, all of the trade entities related to the public sector for making a safer carnival, for example. Brazil is well known for its carnival. So we have involved everybody on receiving information. So restaurants, hotels, agencies, all types of accommodations. And we have involved everybody, only the government, not only the municipalities, the states, the federal government, but also everybody else in these levels, all of them, in the private sector. And this idea was well received. Of course, this is a type of idea that requires not so much resources, which is a very complicated matter, as our colleague from Liberia brought. But still, it is an idea that it is being well accepted. So we see that the sector, mainly in tourism, because of the amount of women working in this sector that we can see, because of this, we are receiving more like a wider acceptance, a wider help, a wider agreement for doing this together. So I see this is only one example, but I am very sure also when you think about Brazil, accommodation sector inside of tourism is majority of women leading this sector. So of course they will receive that well. They are also from private sector, but they will receive that well. We have to have more women leading. And as far as we have it, we will receive this type of initiatives in a wider, nicer, and better way, an easier way, by the way. This is it, I think.
Thank you so much, Camila, for your response. I'll pass now to May about the question about the private sector
Okay.
response. Thank you.
For us here, you'd be surprised that over 70% of the tourism space we have women. When it comes to the employment, when it comes to the are you hearing me?
Yes. We hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry, I went off for a second there. Okay, so what I'm saying, in Liberia, we have over 70% of the tourism space. We have women as in working in the tourism space and even owning businesses. So we don't we have this kind of connect with the private sector because most of the private sector owners and employees are women. For us as an association, fortunately, of the 5 members of the board, 4 of them are women. So in the space, we normally dominate. As far as the ministry is concerned, to be quite frank, we work well with the ministry. We have no issues with the ministry. Those policies that we propose, they usually accept. And the policies, that we try to do a kind of like a 50-50, compromise with things. We are also a part of the the National Tourism Steering Committee is the working group that has on the private sector, public sector, and international partners. So most of course, the international partners will push for gender mainstreaming. Our association, we actually always push for it because most of our members are women. But as far as embracing it, we don't have any problems with the private sector embracing, gender mainstreaming. When it, of course, goes outside into the rural areas, then we have, challenges when it comes to that.
Thank you so much. And now, so we have another question. So I'll go to you first this time, May, please, as you're already here. So there's some questions about budget, and we talked about the challenge of resources. So I'm wondering if you can give us any examples or recommendations for how to advocate for resources, both financial and human, and whether you've managed to secure any kinds of funding or any kinds of financial support for your work on gender equality, either from the government, from the ministry, or from any other sources. So any kind of good practice examples that you can give or tips for that would be great. And then I will ask the same question to Camila, please. So thank you, May.
Okay. There is not so much of resources that are just channeled towards, specifically towards gender mainstreaming. As I mentioned to you, UN Women, we also have a gender ministry that you have in other places, but the priorities are so many. So we will go out there, speak about it, but I can say within the international space, you have USAID that gives out grants, and those grants are usually, it has within it a gender equality type of policy that, these grantees must do certain things, must have certain policies in there for gender equality. And you have the EU is rolling out a policy and implementing. We spoke about the training, a training institute in one of our surfing areas, and that has within it, a gender component. But to say the national budget has something specifically for gender, no. A lot of us are sitting there trying to push it, but I'll be quite frank, it is a challenge. It's not all, success. It is a challenge trying to find, that money, but most of it does come from the international partners.
So much. Thank you for your frank answer. And I think this kind of reiterates what we've been saying as we go through, which is about that it's not easy to secure these resources. So if we wait until we've secured the funding to start work on gender equality, we won't get anywhere. We need to start work with the small amount that we have, that we can access, and then use that to leverage and advocate. So I think it's that very pragmatic political approach, right? Of kind of moving forwards and seeking funding at the same time. So I'll ask the same question to Camila. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, my colleagues. Yeah, I have to agree, and it's not a surprise for anybody. Budget and resources are a problem or challenge for any sector. For our sector, mainly in this specific matter, it is not an easy task to. So something that we can do, and that is very welcome, like to use, as our friend mentioned, yes, the international partnership and sponsorship, but not only. We can have a partnership with the private sectors regarding initiatives and events and other situations that can happen. So we can do it like we did for the Safer Carnival policy, but as well as, for example, the award that then we can use a part of our internal resources and in the ministry to do. And inside of this award that I've mentioned, we have a specific category for women transforming tourism. So for that, we can apply a little of our the budget we have that's too challenging to have, and then we can do initiatives like this, so we can recognize these women and again bring data. Because for you to get more resources, you can again convince. It's already hard to convince with the data. Imagine without it. So we have to struggle, we have to travel and keep insisting. But this is the occasion, this is the thing. We outside and besides this, we make our best to be present in conferences for this women policy building all together. We make our best to sponsor this type of event internally in Brazil when we see that we have room for also being there and for participating. We partner to other public kind of mixed economy entities so we can do better for this type of initiative too. But it's not easy. Budget and resources will always be a challenge, I believe, in every sector, and in our sector, mainly in this specific gender mainstreaming is a little more, I believe.
Thank you so much, Camilla. Really helpful points there. So we have, we're going to overrun by 5 minutes because we started 5 minutes late, and I do have another question around data. So I'm just going to ask you to both the speakers to answer just very briefly. What do you think are the most important data points to collect when we look at women in tourism? So if you can just give us your top 3 data points that are most useful to collect. First of all to Camila, and then to May, and then we will close the webinar. Thank you.
Well, we can start thinking how we are minority in this sector, and still sometimes we are underpaid. So what is the impact for the whole country and the world, if the world is like 54% of the workforce in tourism in the world is women? So what is the impact? And this is also part of our guideline for UN tourism in this matter. What is the impact if you can qualify these women which are minority in the sector and let them also lead, make them capable of leading? It's positive impact. You're gonna have more people that will be qualified, and that you have a wide range of number of them that will be able to bring more positiveness to the sector, that will be able to bring more solutions, that will have a vision that we didn't have before. So this is important. So it's imbalance the number of leaders that we have. So have to gather few points and get these numbers together. And sometimes it's very hard actually to collect right data internally. We have sources as UN Tourism, UN Women that helps us a lot to get these numbers a little more worldwide in a wider perspective. But when you go to this most remote places and rural tourism, and how many women traveling alone? How many of them suffers violence? How many of them, gives up of traveling because they're afraid or because they don't have the resources? How many of them are working in the same position for years along? without having a promotion, without having qualification, without learning another language so they can receive all their tourists. So this is the type of numbers and data that you have to maybe partner with other entities in the public and private sector so you can have track of it. And then when you have track of it, you can pursue effectiveness. Because it's not only getting the data, it's not only talking to somebody about it, it's when you have it, keeping it, studying it, analyzing it, and then bringing it to effectiveness.
Thank you so much for really important points there, Peter. I would ask you the same question, and you also just a very brief response on what do you think is the most important data to have. You also have another question from a colleague about whether you've done any collaboration with the worked at all with the African Union. I believe we did talk about that a little bit in our preparatory discussion. So if you could just briefly tell us about that as well, please. We have colleagues interested in that aspect. And if you wanted to mention as well the Women in Tourism Leadership Program, I think that would be of interest as well. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, I said before, when it comes to data, what we collected and we thought was, the most important, I will name 3 of them. It's that Camilla said, the employment distribution, men versus women in the tourism sector as far as employment is concerned, and also the levels in managerial. How many women do you find in managerial positions compared to men? Also, how is the wage being distributed? Are women getting paid for equal work as men are as their counterparts? That's one of it, employment. And then we talk about the barriers. What are those barriers to women's participation? And it's important to note, for example, the financial, obviously, you have a lot with financial constraints and also educational. So what are the levels of women in these 3 areas and that it is mostly, those are the 3 things that are actually barriers to them participating within the sector. Then another set of data that we thought was important is noting women's participation in the sector, the contribution to the sector. Most of the times, the public sector, those who make financial decisions want to know or make decisions, period, what is the contribution to the national budget? It's the bottom line. What is the bottom line? Why should we even bother to consider them or to do anything more, anything for them if they're not contributing, significantly or at least contributing something to the national, budget. So those are the 3 things I would say that we did 3 kinds of data that we try to collect for the whole development policy. And thanks, because I didn't make mention of it, and thanks, Lucy, and thanks to the person who asked the question. As far as the African Union, right now, the African Union has a project, and it's a focus on, if I'm not mistaken, it's $100 million project, and it's being worked through NAPAD, which is the technical arm of the AU. And they're piloting in 3 countries this project, and it's in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Madagascar, sorry. And so what this program is going to do is to actually develop tourism in the different countries. And one of their main focus is on, gender mainstreaming within everything that we do. So, everything that's being done. So the first visit is in January, early January, where the team is coming to sit along with the government and the private sector to see how we can work on, 1, the policy document. How can we now start to roll out the national tourism policy document? How we can begin to roll out strategies, action plans, and anything else, that they feel and we feel we can come together to do to boost tourism in there. So of course, Our ministry is the Ministry of Information, Cultural Affairs, and Tourism. So the deputy minister who's directly involved with tourism is actually a female. So we worked along with them on that. Then we have the WIT that you talk about, which is the Women in Tourism in Africa, Women in Tourism in Africa Leadership in Africa Committee. So it's the Women in Tourism Leadership Africa Committee. And what we have done as it's a committee comprising women leaders in the public sector across Africa. So you have mostly women tourism ministers, as well as from the private sector, you have leaders, women leaders in the private sector. So they're on that committee. And one of the things, or our very first initiative as a committee, is to set up a mentorship program in all of the members. And so we start with the low-hanging fruits for those of us in the, well, I mean, every woman that's in the space has a mentorship program with some women. So what we are going to do is mentor women, look into education, and it led me to the question that was asked about what is the interaction with the private sector. And what I forgot to say, there are private sector actors that are even leading programs. They have within their programs that develop women in the tourism sector. We have our, telcos, the telephone companies that are doing that. You have also ITC that came up, and USAID that came up also with a project where they're training women in being media ready for their businesses. There are all of these things that they're out there. And as I said before, the thing is to be in the space to know that these things exist. Work along with the public sector. We work, as I said before, closely with the government. So the government feels very free. They feel that they should always call us to be a part of whatever they are doing, and vice versa.
Yes, thanks for your answer. And thank you everyone for your contributions here. I'm just going to give a quick note. What can you do next? Number one, read the guidelines, share the guidelines. You can find them in the chat. Please share the guidelines in the chat, read them, share them. The Ministry of Tourism in Brazil has translated them to Portuguese and circulated them to many different colleagues. So please do that. When you find in the guidelines, you have a self-assessment checklist for each of the steps. Have a look, work it out, see how well you're doing, where you want to get started. Join us in these events. Join us tomorrow in our event for the private sector. And finally, contact UN Tourism if you're interested in working on this in more depth. You have the email here and in the chat as well. So I'd just like to close by saying thank you so much to both of our speakers, to May and to Camila, for the wonderful insights shared. And if you want to, everyone, just put on your camera and you can unmute and just say hello and wave. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, UN Tourism. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Gracias. Hasta luego.
Adios.
Thank you.